Have you ever paused and asked yourself, what truly makes a man not just respected, but deeply cherished by the people around him? Not because of how much he earns or what he looks like, but because of how he makes others feel in his presence. In a world where love is often mistaken for passion and relationships are reduced to fleeting moments, we sometimes forget the power of quiet devotion. We forget that real intimacy, the kind that endures decades, survives storms, and strengthens families, is not loud or showy. It's gentle, it's intentional, it's sacred. This video is not about rules or romance. It's about something deeper. It's about a kind of love that starts with respect, grows through presence, and is remembered not in grand gestures, but in small moments that whisper, "I see you, I honor you, I am with you." In this story, passed down through generations, we'll explore what intimacy once meant in a time before distractions, before noise, when love was lived, not just spoken. You'll hear the kind of wisdom that doesn't fade with age but becomes clearer with time. And perhaps you'll begin to see love itself through a different lens. Before we begin, if this kind of depth speaks to you, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us. The lessons shared here are timeless, and your presence helps us carry them forward. Number 1, the story of Madame Laura. There is something timeless about the way wisdom settles in a quiet village, the kind of place where the wind carries old stories and the trees remember. It was in such a village, surrounded by hills that glowed gold in the late afternoon sun, that a woman lived whose presence carried the weight of generations. Her home stood at the edge of the village, modest in size but rich in something far more valuable than wealth. It carried the warmth of memory. The walls were lined not with decorations, but with echoes of laughter, prayers, and long conversations held over tea. There was no need for grandeur. Her presence was enough. People didn't come to her for advice the way one consults a book. They came for something deeper. They came to be reminded of what really matters. And so it was on one autumn evening, as the sky turned amber and the air grew crisp, a group of young villagers made their way to her door. They didn't know exactly what they were seeking, only that something in their hearts was restless. She welcomed them without question. Her eyes, lined with age, sparkled with a quiet joy. She had seen this before, the hunger for meaning, the ache for understanding. It came in waves across generations, and she, like her grandmother before her, would meet it with stillness. The group settled around a table worn with time, its wooden surface smoothed by decades of hands resting on it, stories being told over it, tears shed into it. The table itself had become a silent witness to lives unfolding. It was not just furniture, it was memory made solid. For a few moments there was only silence. The kind of silence that stretches not because there is nothing to say, but because something important is about to be spoken. Then from the edge of the group, a young man cleared his throat. There was something brave in his voice, something trembling and raw. He asked her a question most would never dare to speak aloud, a question about intimacy, about something rarely discussed with elders, let alone revered ones. But he didn't ask out of curiosity or bravado. He asked from a place of sincerity, a deep longing to understand. What is the deeper meaning behind oral intimacy? The room stilled, not out of discomfort, but respect. It was a question that deserved an answer not from opinion, but from experience. And she, who had lived long enough to see both the depth and distortion of love, nodded slowly. "I'm glad you asked," she said. Her voice was soft but certain. It held the tone of someone who had carried truth long enough to know when to speak it gently. And what followed was not a lecture, not instruction, but the story, memory, sacred understanding. She spoke of how her ancestors viewed intimacy, not as a performance but as a language, a sacred offering. Oral intimacy, she explained, when rooted in love, was once considered a man's way of honoring the divine within his partner. Not to impress, not to possess, but to serve, to give, to revere. It was about more than desire. It was about devotion. She paused, letting her words sink in. And in that moment, the young people began to understand that love is not about what you take. It's about what you choose to give freely, with care, with awareness of the soul behind the skin. And so the conversation deepened, unfolding slowly, like the petals of a flower warmed by morning light. Number 2, the wisdom of Helio. After the evening at Madame Laura's home, something within the group had shifted. They had entered seeking answers, but left with something far greater, a glimpse into a way of living, loving, and relating that felt almost forgotten in today's world. Yet their hearts now stirred, longed for more. Not just more stories, but more understanding. And so, drawn by the whispers of wisdom that still lingered in the air, they made their way toward the home of another elder. His name was Helio. Helio was known throughout the region, not just for his knowledge, but for the way he spoke, as if each word had been carved from experience, softened by kindness, and offered as a gift. His house was small, set back from the road, wrapped in ivy and memory. A warm light flickered from within, casting gentle shadows across the worn path that led to his door. When he opened it, the fire behind him crackled like an old friend calling them in. His face, etched with time and tenderness, broke into a quiet smile as he saw the group. He didn't need to ask why they had come. He had seen that look before, the look of young people who had begun to question what they had been told about love, and now sought something real. They sat by the fire. No one spoke at first. There was no need. The room itself invited reflection. Books lined the walls, their pages curled with use. Wooden beams overhead held stories as old as the village itself. And in the center of it all sat Helio, his hands resting gently on his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, not commanding, but grounding. Intimacy, he said slowly, is one of the most misunderstood things in our world today. He didn't rush. He didn't preach. He let each word breathe as if it needed time to settle into the hearts that were listening. People think it's about touch, about bodies, about the excitement of being wanted. But true intimacy, that's something else. It's about being known, truly known, and still truly accepted. He leaned forward slightly, eyes still watching the fire, as if drawing from it the language of truth. Real closeness doesn't begin in the bedroom. It begins in silence. In the way you listen when someone speaks, in the way you pay attention to their mood, even when they say nothing. It begins with how you carry their pain when they're too tired to speak it aloud. The group sat, still as stone. There was something about his presence that made everything outside the room disappear. No distractions, no noise, just the steady rhythm of his voice, like a drumbeat calling them back to something ancient. He began to tell them stories, not fairy tales, not grand fables, but the quiet, powerful stories of men he had known. Men who came home after long days of labor, their hands rough with work, their backs sore from effort, and yet somehow they still found it in themselves to kneel at their wife's feet, to wash her hands, to bring her tea, to hold her without needing anything in return. They weren't trying to impress, Helio said. They were remembering what it meant to love someone in a way that restored them, that protected them, that made them feel at home. And then, almost as if he had read their thoughts, he spoke again, this time more gently. Even acts of physical intimacy, like the one you spoke of with Madame Laura, they are not about excitement alone. They are about reverence, about saying, I see the sacred in you, and I come not to take, but to honor. He looked up then, his gaze meeting theirs. When you love someone like that, With that kind of presence, it changes you. It humbles you. Because you're no longer loving with your ego. You're loving with your spirit. The fire crackled softly, as if echoing his words. Outside, the night deepened, but inside that room, a light had been kindled. And in that stillness, the young people saw something they would never forget. That love, at its deepest level, is not something to be performed or proved. It is something to be lived, quietly, consistently, with care. Before we continue, if you find yourself moved by these stories, if they awaken something within you that longs for deeper understanding and a quieter, truer way to love, consider subscribing to this channel. Your presence here matters. It helps us keep these timeless lessons alive, and it allows us to share more stories that nourish the heart. Number 3, a community transformed. The morning after they visit Madame Laura and Helio, the village awoke as it always had. The wind still rustled through the trees. The rooster still called to the rising sun. Life continued, but for those who had gathered the night before, something invisible had shifted. They walked through familiar paths with unfamiliar awareness. The world looked the same, yet something within them had been rearranged. At first, it was hard to name, but over the days and weeks that followed, the change became visible, not just in thought, but in action. The young men, once more concerned with proving themselves, began to soften, not in weakness, but in awareness. They looked at their partners not as extensions of themselves, but as individuals carrying their own sacred stories. They began to listen more, not to respond, but to understand. They offered gestures of affection not to win favor, but because they genuinely wanted to give. Quietly, consistently, they began to honor. In return, the women in the village noticed something they hadn't felt in years. Not just attention, but care. Not just help, but devotion. Their hearts, once worn thin by routine and unspoken expectations, began to soften too. They smiled more easily, laughed more freely, and in their eyes there glimmered something both new and ancient, the feeling of being seen. It wasn't just the couple who changed, it was the way the entire community began to move. The marketplace, once bustling with hurried exchanges, began to feel warmer. People lingered longer, asked how others were, not to be polite, but to know. Children, watching the quiet shifts in their parents, began to absorb a new understanding of love, one built not on drama, but on depth. The teachings of the elders had started a ripple. No one stood in the center of the village to declare a transformation. No ceremony was held, no great banner unfurled to mark the change. And yet it was there, in every softened glance, in every hand that lingered just a moment longer on a loved one's shoulder, in every silent offering of support. Marriages that had grown tired found new breath, not from sweeping romantic gestures, but from simple acts. A husband rising early to warm water for his wife's bath. A wife placed her hand gently on her partner's chest as he drifted to sleep, just to remind him she was near. These things did not cost money. They caught attention. They required presence, and that was what had changed most. The village, without meaning to, had begun to remember. Remember what love looked like before it was dressed up in expectations. What intimacy felt like before it became something awkward or transactional. They had rediscovered love as a way of life. And those who had once doubted the importance of such things began to see their quiet power. Even those who had long been alone found themselves touched by this cultural shift. Neighbors checked in more often. Friends shared stories without rushing. There was time again for conversation, for reflection, for connection. Helio and Madame Laura watched all of this unfold from a distance, their hearts full, but not surprised. They had not set out to change anyone. They had only shared what had been given to them, and that, they knew, was the nature of true wisdom. It asks for nothing, but gives everything. Toward the end of the season, On a particularly gentle evening, the villagers gathered for a harvest celebration. Candles flickered on wooden tables. Bread was passed from hand to hand, and in the soft glow of twilight, the elders were invited to speak once more. This time, they did not need to teach. They only needed to remind. Madame Laura stood, her voice clear and warm. "Love," she said, "is not something you chase. It is something you tend to, like a fire, like a garden. It does not roar every day. Sometimes it is just a soft ember, but it is always there, if you choose to keep it alive." And Helio added, "The most extraordinary thing about intimacy is how ordinary it can be. A glance, a word, a moment of stillness. These are the places where love lives." That night, the village did not sleep early, not because of noise or celebration, but because so many people found themselves lying awake, reflecting, reconnecting, reaching out perhaps to a hand they had once stopped holding, whispering something they hadn't said in years. And in that quiet, something bloomed. Not a new way of living, but an ancient one, remembered. Number 4, when love becomes a way of life. In the months that followed, no one in the village spoke of transformation as if it were a milestone. It was never declared, never written in any record, but it was felt, it was lived, and in time, it simply became the new rhythm of life. The older couples, who had once fallen into habits of silence and distance, began to find new language in their touch, their glances, and their shared memories. They didn't try to recapture their youth. They honored what had grown in its place, a quieter love, a sturdier kind, one that had weathered storms and still stood, not because it had never cracked, but because they had chosen time and again to mend it. One afternoon, a young couple, newly married and full of questions, visited Madame Laura. They sat with her in the small garden behind her home, where the lavender swayed gently in the breeze. The young woman asked, "How do we make sure our love lasts?" Madame Laura smiled, not with amusement, but with understanding. She looked at the two of them, their hands loosely intertwined, and said, "You don't need to make it last. You need to make it real. If it is real, it will take root, and if you tend it with care, it will outlast everything you think it needs to survive." She spoke of how love should never become background noise in one's life, that even after years together, we must choose to return to each other, not out of duty, but out of desire. That even when time has worn down the thrill of newness, it can polish the edges of intimacy until they gleam with something more precious than passion: presence. At the other end of the village, Helio welcomed a widower into his home. The man had lost his wife of 40 years and was drowning in the silence she left behind. Helio didn't offer platitudes. He didn't speak of moving on or healing. He simply poured tea, lit a candle, and said, "Tell me about how she loved you." And slowly, with tears in his eyes, the man did. He spoke of the way she folded his shirts just the way he liked, of how she always touched his arm when she walked past him, of how she left a small flower beside his plate every Sunday, without fail. It was in the remembering that the man found solace, and Helio, listening deeply, reminded him of something profound, that the greatest proof of love is not how loudly it begins, but how quietly it continues. These were not just moments of healing, they were moments of teaching. Without trying, the elders had become mirrors, reflecting back to their community the truth that love is not a performance. It is not a destination, it is a practice. Love in this village had become the way people moved through the world. It lived in how they greeted each other in the morning, in how they forgave without spectacle, in how they made space for grief and joy alike, in how they honored connection, not just in romance, but in friendship, in family, and in the way they treated strangers. And so, as time went on, the younger generation grew up carrying something invisible, yet deeply felt, a heritage of devotion, a quiet knowing that real love is not fragile. It is fierce in its gentleness. It holds, it listens, it stays. They had inherited not just stories, but a way of being. And even long after Madame Laura and Helio had gone, their voices remained, in the way lovers spoke, in the way neighbors cared, in the way a man knelt not to propose, but to tie the shoe of the woman who had walked beside him for decades. Love had become not just something they shared, it had become who they were. As we come to the end of this story, I invite you to pause, not just to reflect on what you've heard, but to gently examine the kind of love you carry in your own life. Have you made space for presence, for reverence, for the quiet gestures that say more than words ever could? Have you honored the people beside you, not with declarations, but with attention? Not with perfection, but with care? Because in the end, what matters most is not how grand our expressions are, but how consistently we choose to show up, how we choose again and again to love with intention. What this village rediscovered wasn't new. It was something ancient, something we all carry the capacity for, if we remember to slow down and listen, to lean in, to live gently, and to love deliberately. So wherever you are, however old your story is, know this: it is never too late to choose a deeper kind of connection, one that honors, one that sees, one that lasts. If this story touched something in you, something quiet, something honest, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Not for numbers, not for clicks, but because stories like these deserve to be remembered and passed on, and your presence helps us keep that circle alive. Thank you for spending this time with me, and may you carry the wisdom of this tale not just in your memory, but in the way you love every single day.